Now to the conversation we've been having this week with professor at Harvard University, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Annette Gordon-Reed. She's back with her new book titled On Juneteenth, about the announcement in Texas of the end of slavery in America and the subsequent system of Jim Crow in the state and the country. Also with us, author, poet, and writer-in-residence at Vanderbilt University, Caroline Randall Williams. It's good to have you both. Annette, this morning, we're focusing on the violence that still followed Juneteenth, and you specifically talk about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, perhaps the worst episode of Jim Crow violence in the nation's history. Here's part of a USA Today report on it from just last year.
We were not the perpetrators, we were the victims. But it took 80 years to get the state of Oklahoma to acknowledge that.
The Tulsa Race Massacre is believed to be one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history. From May 31st to June 1st in 1921, as many as 300 people were killed, hundreds were injured, and thousands of buildings were destroyed.
On June 1st, they began to systematically destroy neighborhoods, and they had airplanes dropping things down on people's houses, and they had made up their minds to clear the entire area of black people.
It started after a newspaper reported a black man tried to sexually assault a white woman.
Later this month will be the 100th anniversary of that massacre. A Trump rally a year ago inadvertently brought new attention to that act of terror, as well as Juneteenth. But otherwise, you say, Annette, dark chapters like that massacre have gone relatively unnoticed. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, after the end of slavery and white Southerners lost the power that they had over African American people, they unleashed a torrent of violence on the freedmen. And it was something that started as soon as 1865 when they made the announcement. Remember, I told you that people who had been celebrating the announcement of the end of slavery were beaten, were whipped by their former enslavers. And the resentment that people had about this notion of equality, Granger's order mentions the word, suggests that blacks were now going to live on an equal plane with whites. And there were many people who just could not take that after their culture that made slavery a part of their way of life. And so throughout the years, there are other instances, not so dramatic as the Tulsa riot, but situations where black people in a particular town were essentially run out and people took over their land. They look at census records. There were a certain number of black people, one time the census was done and the next time they came back, there were none. Sundown towns, black people had to be indoors by a certain period of time. All of these kinds of things, trying to maintain the kind of control that people had during slavery, but without the actual slave system. So violence was a part of this from 1865 on, when black people ceased to be of financial value to whites. They turned on them.
And Annette, you talk about the history of Jim Crow, vigilante, so-called justice in the state of Texas. You tell the terrible story of Bob White, who was accused of rape, tried repeatedly, taken out, beaten by Texas Rangers every night, forced confession, and that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Tell us about it.
Yes, this was a case, ironically, that my grandfather used to tell me about. He knew Bob White, and I didn't realize until I was working on this book that it actually went up to the Supreme Court. Bob White was tried repeatedly. One good thing about that is the Texas court system saw a problem with this. It was obviously a due process violation of the 14th Amendment. But when he's on trial, the last time, the husband of the woman he had was accused of raping walked into the courtroom, shot him in the back of the head, and killed him. And nothing happened to him. He was, acquitted and went on to, to live. So he was murdered in front of the judges and the jury and the spectators in the courtroom, and nothing took place.
And Annette, you write in the book that while this type of justice, if you want to call it that, was playing out in West Texas, it was getting the support and the backing of the federal government, in effect, that this Jim Crow justice was being supported by federal systems.
Well, I mean, there was nothing. We have a system of federalism, and the things that goes on in the states, the feds can't do anything about it unless they actually find a constitutional violation, the violation of the federal Constitution. There was not a move after the end of Reconstruction, 1877, and the troops were pulled out of the South. Black people were left to the tender mercies, we'll use that phrase, of their former enslavers. And it wasn't a pretty picture at all. I mean, there were people who tried to help. There were allies. But for the most part, they were living in a system that's, behind an iron curtain, essentially, until the 1960s, 1950s, that was what the civil rights movement was about, is to try to move beyond all of these kinds of things. But this stuff had, origins in the in the 1860s with the end of slavery. Once again, when Black people ceased to be of value as enslaved people, then they were a mere nuisance, and people did not want them to be a part of the civic society. We're still fighting this voting rights battle today. There's a long history to all of this, and we're still connected to that past.
Yeah, and Caroline, I know you've got a question for Annette, but it's so interesting listening to her talk about the resentment that many white Southerners felt at the end of slavery. We've had you on to talk about Confederate monuments that were spread across the South, and were spread across the South actually right before I was born, as the civil rights movement started to gain momentum. And it was in reaction to the civil rights movement. It was more of that white resentment. And of course, it had nothing to do with, at that time, anything more than a pushback against a burgeoning movement that tried to give Black Americans more freedom.
Well, I think that's exactly right, Joe. I think, much of Annette's work and much of what I'm interested in writing about and teaching about is this question of how we remember better so that we can make a better future. And I think that one of the important things for us to remember is why those monuments were put up. They were put up as acts of terror, not actually acts of memorial. And I think when we can't look back and think about that, I'm just thinking today, right now, my own state, Tennessee, they're trying to withhold funding from schools that want to teach critical race theory, for example. People don't want to remember accurately. And I think it's a failure of moral imagination on the part of the country to not be able to do that. And I think that to me, that's one of the things that I wanted to talk to Annette about, is this question of, to me, the idea that a Black person can love America, knowing what we know about what this place has been. Our patriotism has a different kind of backbone than these cowardly people who can't look back and integrate into their memory the truths that we've known this whole time. And I want to think about how we navigate that. Like, how do we do the work to reframe that part of the principle of American patriotism in the face of these people who don't want to remember what we've been in order to get where we need to go. And so I'm dying to hear your insight about it.
Well, it's a tough question. The only thing I could say, and I'm sure W.E.B. Du Bois thought that African Americans, because of the experiences that we've had, have a special message for the world, essentially, how to persevere in the face of oppression. The only thing I can say is that I don't think we can spend too much time trying to convince people who think that we're not human beings, that we're human beings. That's not our task in the world. Our task is to keep on the path that our ancestors before us went down in order to be in a situation where we can have a better life. And I think the work has to be done among ourselves, the work among allies, people who recognize our humanity, and go forward the way we've always been going forward. I mean, I think trying to convince people that you're human it's degrading. It's nothing anybody should have to do. They either know it or they don't. And if they don't want to live by that, there's nothing we can do. We just continue on the path that we have been on with the lessons that we've learned from our ancestors, from our own experiences.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.